Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something a bit different, almost like a piece of historical forensics.
Yeah.
We're not just looking at a conquest, one army beating another. We're looking at a tragedy that was really facilitated by self-destruction, a systemic failure that ran straight through the heart of the Inca Empire. It's what made them so fatally brittle right at the moment the Spanish arrived.
Exactly. It's a collapse from within.
And our focus today is that immediate, brutal prelude to the collapse. I'm talking about the devastating civil war, the succession crisis between the two half-brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa. And to really get a grip on this, to feel the depth of this political rupture, we have to start not with, abstract ideas, but with a really visceral, factual image.
Okay.
So picture this. It's the Andamarca River. The water is all heavy with silt and mud. And there's a body floating face down. You can't really recognize it, except for the fragments that are clinging to it. You see the insignia of the empire, that imperial red tassel, the Mascaipacha, the symbol of unchallengeable power.
The ultimate symbol.
It's torn, it's soaked, it's clotted with river junk. It's just clinging to the head like this horrible wound. And the hands, slack, fragments of gold, pieces of this incredibly fine woven cloth are just sort of bobbing around the corpse. This is the precise end of Huáscar. This is the moment the sun really began to set on Cusco.
What you've just described, it's so much more than a regicide. It's the physical evidence of a total collapse of political legitimacy. The man in that water, Huáscar, he was the Sapa Inca, the recognized heir of Huayna Capac. His position was the core of everything. He was the guardian of ancestral law, the figure whose very existence validated this enormous complex bureaucracy of the entire empire, the Tawantinsuyu.
Right.
So to study that scene, just like you said, is to trace this fault line in governance. The final fall wasn't just about Pizarro's soldiers and a few cannons. It was fundamentally a rupture of internal trust, a shattering of the coherence that held that whole thing together. Our mission today is to keep that detail right at the center. We're going to explore the armies, the betrayals, the massacres.
And that slow erosion of stability.
The slow, methodical erosion of institutional stability that turned their ritual authority into something brittle, something that just couldn't stand up to the external heat and steel of the conquistadors.
It's a mission to understand how the Inca Empire basically committed political suicide. It dismantled itself piece by piece before the Europeans even had a chance to really take control.
An empire already collapsing inward.
Yeah. Okay, so let's unpack this. We have to start the clock way before Pizarro even shows up. The real systemic shock, the first domino, it began with an enemy you couldn't see and you couldn't fight, introduced disease.
Smallpox.
Exactly. The death of Huayna Capac, the last great Sapa Inca from these European epidemics, it didn't just remove a king, it basically decapitated a system that completely relied on the centralized, visible presence of the ruler to maintain order.
You really can't overstate the scale of the administrative chaos that followed his death. I mean, think about the Inca state's infrastructure. It was all organized by precise ritual timing, by agricultural planning, communication across thousands of miles of roads.
The famous road network.
The problem was, the epidemics advanced faster than the messengers could physically carry the news of the Sapa Inca's death, which meant you had this long, agonizing period of administrative limbo where local authorities didn't know who was in charge. Or even worse, they'd find out that the designated successor had also just died in the same wave of sickness.
Wait, can you put that into context for us? How fast are we talking? Because we always hear about the road network, the Kapagnan, and how efficient it was. The messengers, the Chasquis, could cover huge distances.
Oh, they were incredibly efficient, yes. They could cover maybe 150 miles in a day. But the disease front was just relentless. It's estimated that the smallpox epidemic that killed Huayna Capac might have arrived in the Inca heartland years before the Spanish themselves actually did.
Years before.
Years. And this created a situation where towns just emptied out suddenly, often before a harvest or a planting cycle was complete.
Oh, that's disastrous.
It's the worst case scenario. Crucial harvests were missed, especially in those high altitude zones where timing is absolutely everything. The whole carefully calibrated ritual calendar, which governed both religion and labor, it lost its punctuation marks. It just fell apart.
And in that vacuum.
In that vacuum, local leaders, the curacas, they were forced to make decisions on the fly. Decentralized decisions about food, about labor, about defense. And this is happening at the precise moment the empire needed unified central command. The very foundations of the logistical state were seizing up.
And that vacuum, it just instantly exposes this inherent tension, maybe even a flaw, in the Inca succession system itself. In theory, it was flexible, right? The ruler wasn't always the eldest son, but the most capable one, the one the gods chose. But in practice, it was brutal because that choice had to be validated through force. You needed both sacred kinship and you needed to prove your military necessity. There was no neutral process for transferring that much power.
Precisely. And so the split that followed was almost predictable. It was structural. You had two centers of gravity that formed immediately. In the south, you had Huáscar. He's in Cusco, the ancient capital. He represents continuity, the centuries-old ritual order.
The establishment.
Yeah. He embodies the sanctity of the lineage, the ceremonies, the cloak, the red tassel, all the traditions that convinced the subject peoples that the universe was still in balance under Inca rule. His claim was deeply, deeply theological.
And then in the north, you have Atahualpa. And he represents something totally different, something newer, more pragmatic, an expansionary military mind. He's based in Quito, surrounded by the very commanders who had been schooled in the difficult conquests of that northern frontier.
Right.
And his faction, they basically believed that legitimacy came from proven force, from demonstration, not just from inherited ceremony. They'd fought for their power, and they saw Huáscar's authority as...
And this is where we really have to get into the Andean political theology for a second. Both of these positions, they had deep theological roots. You had the ritual continuity anchored in Cusco, the center of the cosmos. But you also had the demonstrated military might of the northern armies, which was its own form of divine mandate through conquest.
So both sides could claim they were fulfilling a divine purpose.
Exactly. But the disease, it opened up this space where tradition and force they no longer aligned, suddenly, violently. When the center dies without a clear, universally recognized successor, the very basis of imperial authority, that balance between ritual stability and expansionary success, it was up for grabs. It was a theological crisis, not just a political one.
So it sounds like the very things that made the empire strong, the road network, the storehouses, they suddenly started accelerating the conflict instead of preserving unity.
That's a fantastic point. The road system, the Kapaknyan, which was this logistical wonder of the world, it suddenly becomes a corridor not for state management, but for moving soldiers, and for unchecked paranoia between the two courts. Intense suspicion. The advisors on both sides, driven by fear and ambition, they start framing this conflict. They create these narratives that make violence seem like a necessary correction.
A way to restore order.
Right. Not the high crime of civil war. And the sources, they describe the first violent acts as almost clinical, intimate and precise, one says. Envoys traveling between the courts would come back not just with letters, but with blood on their clothes. Deliberate messages.
Wow. So the Southern Court in Cusco saw any northern overtures, even diplomatic ones, as just imposture.
A trick, an attempt to usurp sacred authority,
And on the other side, the northern commanders saw any southern hesitancy, any reliance on ritual instead of action as terminal weakness.
Ripe for exploitation. This spiraling reciprocal paranoia just cemented the belief that the empire was not big enough for both of them.
Which leads us straight to the point of no return. Huáscar's decision to execute the ambassador sent from Quito. Now, from his perspective in Cusco, this move had a kind of legal logic. He was the Sapa Inca. He was protecting the sacred center from sedition, from treason. That was his framework.
But for the Northern Court, that act was an affront so egregious, it just destroyed any remaining basis for negotiation. It justified total war. The murder of high-ranking envoys is the ultimate violation of diplomatic convention. It signals that the rules are gone.
The gloves are off.
Completely. The fragile trust of the empire just evaporated in that moment, and the civil war became existential. Total.
Okay, so if Huáscar's execution of the envoys was the spark, the military leadership from Quito, they defined the inferno. We have to talk about these northern generals, Chalcuchimec, Quisquis, Rumiñahui. These were guys who were hardened not just by one battle, but by years of tough frontier campaigns up in what's now Ecuador.
They were professionals.
They had mastered logistics, conquest, and they moved towards Cusco with this terrifying, ruthless efficiency.
And their response to that rupture was systematic. It went way beyond just punitive strikes. For these generals, cruelty was a kind of tactical language. They used it to demonstrate the futility of resistance, to show the utter dominance of Atahualpa's faction. They weren't just trying to defeat Huáscar.
They were trying to unmake his entire world.
They were moving to unmake an alternative center of power. And that required destroying not just his armies, but the very symbols of the legitimacy he represented.
What did that symbolic warfare actually look like? They weren't just winning battles, they were targeting institutions.
That is the crucial distinction, yes.
Wow.
They targeted core political symbols. So stone temples were burned. But what was more devastating was that the Panaka, the royal lineages of past deified rulers, were publicly insulted, humiliated.
We need to pause on the Panaka system for a second. These weren't just like the dead king's immediate family, right?
Not at all. They were so much more. When an Inca died, most of his wealth, his estates, his servants, and most critically his mummy, the Melki, were kept by his Panaka. This lineage group then maintained the dead Inca's cult, they managed his vast economic holdings, and they provided administrators and advisors to the current Sapa Inca.
So they were basically functioning economic and administrative powerhouses. They were the institutional memory of the state.
Exactly. They were the institutional pillars of the Cusco establishment. So when the northern generals insulted or attacked the Panaka, seizing their lands, desecrating their shrines, it directly diminished the credibility of Cusco as the universal sacred center of the Inca cosmos.
It's not just a military move.
It's an attack on the foundational religious and economic structure of the South.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because this whole strategy was apparently deeply influenced by Atahualpa's own personal experience. You see this profound psychological change in him, especially after he was captured or humiliated by Huáscar's forces at Tomabamba.
The exact details are a little hazy, but the narrative is consistent. There's a moment of disgrace, a period of captivity, and then a motivated, maybe even miraculous escape. And that humiliation, it turned shame into motive. It turned anger into a methodical, unrelenting policy for just eradicating the rival order.
He learned firsthand that you couldn't just defeat your enemy.
You had to annihilate them. Total annihilation was the only way.
And once Atahualpa gets back to his generals, the Northern Army stops acting like a simple coalition and starts acting like this disciplined, monolithic instrument of total war. They systematically destroy cities that showed any loyalty to Huáscar.
Tomabamba itself, a major city, was just systematically reduced to rubble. And the long-term consequence of that wasn't just the death toll. It was what you could call a deep erosion of institutional memory. They targeted the very nerves of the southern system.
And that destruction must have had a ripple effect.
A profound one. The physical destruction led to this massive administrative loss that just crippled the state's ability to function. Survivors of these attacks carried stories of humiliation and violation that just hardened the justification for retaliation across the South. It made any future reconciliation, even after a victory, completely impossible. The northern victories didn't just win a war, they dismantled all the loyalty networks and replaced authority with terror.
You mentioned the symbolic power of the Panaka earlier. So how did Atahualpa's forces really capitalize on that? Was there like a political atom bomb in this conflict?
Oh, absolutely. Atahualpa's strategy culminated in acts that were meant to annihilate the southern dynasty's symbols of legitimacy. I'm talking about the deliberate desecration and destruction of the mummies and shrines of past Incas. This is the act that ensures the political death of your opponent.
And for the Andean worldview, that's not just symbolic, is it?
It's everything. For these peoples, the ritual continuity of ancestor worship is political continuity. The mummies of the past Sapa Incas were not just relics. They were active, ritually served members of the community and the state. They owned land. They were consulted in ceremonies.
So destroying them.
Destroying those mummies wasn't just disrespect. It was a statement of permanent cosmological obliteration, a denial of any future political life for Huáscar's entire lineage.
Wow. So if the Panaka were the state's institutional memory, how did the North go about destroying the practical day-to-day administration?
Well, the administrative muscle of the empire just completely atrophied. The people who knew how to read the quipu, those intricate knot records that tracked everything from census data to military logistics to tribute payments.
The state's hard drives, basically.
Exactly. The people who could read those, the quipu kamioks, and the people who managed the vast network of storehouses. They were specifically targeted. They were killed, they were relocated, or they were forced into deep hiding.
By targeting the quipu readers, the North effectively wiped the empire's main server.
That's a perfect analogy. You strip the empire of its operational memory and its capacity for complex governance. So by the time the northern commanders thought the throne was secure, which is right before the Spanish fully arrive, the polity they were claiming to rule had already been hollowed out. It was a military victory that came at the cost of being able to actually run the place.
And that internal dismantling is the crucial context you have to hold on to. When the Spanish arrive, they are walking into a state that is already suffering from political incompetence, logistical disruption, and a crisis of belief.
The empire was already falling apart, which made the external assault a far, far simpler calculus for Pizarro.
Okay, so this brings us to the arrival of the Spanish. And we have to see Pizarro and his tiny band not as the sole cause, but as these expert opportunists who just stepped right into this existing deep fracture.
Right into the fault line.
They entered a world whose internal coherence was already catastrophically damaged. And the specific location matters so much. Cajamarca, a high-altitude Inca city. They chose a plaza, a center of power, to make their move. They knew, symbolically, that seizing the sovereign there would have the biggest effect.
And Atahualpa, now the undisputed winner of the Civil War, battle-hardened, fresh off his victory. He made a fatal miscalculation. He engaged these strangers with the exact same confidence and worldview he had used against his internal rival, Huáscar.
So in his mind, the real danger was still internal.
The core danger was political. It was Huáscar's surviving loyalists and the vast number of people in the south who still resisted the northern regime. This small group of oddly dressed men on big animals with loud weapons.
Anomaly.
An anomaly. They were strange, for sure, but they were not the existential threat.
Oh, wait, if the Inca generals like Chacorchimac were so hardened, why didn't they recognize the tactical superiority of cavalry and guns? Was it just arrogance, or did they literally not have a category for that kind of force?
It was more than arrogance. It was a conceptual barrier. The Inca military philosophy was all about mass, logistics, discipline, seizing terrain. They fought wars of maneuver with huge armies. The Spanish tactics, shock, rapid movement, concentrated firepower from just a few individuals. It just didn't fit into their military framework.
So they saw it as, what, just noise?
Loud, strange anomalies, not a decisive strategic threat that could break formation or morale on a large scale. And the Spanish exploited that error with cold calculation, combining religious rhetoric with battlefield deception.
Luring Atahualpa into the plaza.
And using superior tactics to compensate for their ridiculously small numbers.
The capture of Atahualpa in that plaza, it was swift and it was brutal. It relied on absolute shock, the terrifying noise of the firearms, the speed of the cavalry, and critically, the complete collapse of the Inca command structure to coordinate a defense of their own sovereign.
That's the key.
It stands out not because the Europeans were invincible, but because the Inca political system, which had just invested everything in the person of Atahualpa, it failed at its most basic duty, protecting him.
And this leads us to Pizarro's strategic masterpiece, taking Atahualpa alive.
Yeah.
A living sovereign was the ultimate leverage. The entire relationship immediately shifts into something transactional, the Sapa Inca's life in exchange for a staggering, unimaginable ransom.
Okay, let's unpack this collision of two worldviews right here. For the Inca, gold and silver, they were symbolic. They were tied to the sun and the moon, used for ceremony, for sacred power. And now, this metal suddenly becomes a contractual token in this grim negotiation.
That's absolutely right. And Atahualpa, confined but lucid, he studies the Spanish psychology. He quickly realizes their overriding motivation is just greed, and that they are fundamentally bound by a calculus of material exchange, a concept far more central to their worldview than to his.
And that realization leads to this desperate, extraordinary agreement.
He offers to fill a massive room, once with gold and twice with silver. This act of wealth transfer immediately alters the strategic balance of power. It concentrates all this treasure into Spanish hands, and it changes gold overnight from a sacred, ceremonial material into a massive fiscal asset in the European sense.
It's just astonishing. A room full of gold. How much wealth did that actually represent? I mean, in terms of labor and economic power for the Inca.
It's almost impossible to quantify, but we can look at the physical numbers. We're talking about over 13,000 pounds of gold and 26,000 pounds of silver.
That's insane.
And this wasn't just what they had lying around, it was what they could immediately mobilize. The sheer labor involved in melting down sacred objects, stripping temples, and transporting that volume of metal across the Andes. It was an unprecedented act of resource extraction.
It must have just gutted their economy.
It fundamentally changed it. It showed that the source of spiritual power, gold, was now the key to political survival buying your life. And this transaction just confirmed to all the southern provinces that this new northern regime, which was now paying off strangers with sacred material, was totally illegitimate. It just deepened the internal rot.
So as this ransom is flowing in, and it's a staggering amount, The Spanish officers start getting nervous about the political reality they've created. Even with Atahualpa as a captive, the situation is precarious. And then rumors of Huáscar's continuing existence, even under house arrest, start reaching the camp.
Right.
And the mere presence of an alternative, legitimate claim to the throne was a massive strategic threat to Pizarro's plan to rule through one person.
And this is where we get into the true gray area of motive and opportunity. And it's critical for you to understand the layered incentives here. Eliminating Huáscar, that was entirely sensible for Atahualpa's own survival. It follows the brutal political logic of the civil war he just won. But at the same time, the Spanish camp had huge incentives to fragment any potential coalition against them. If Huáscar is alive, Pizarro could, in theory, free him and rule through him as a proxy. If Huáscar dies, well, the Spanish eliminate a strategic complication and are left with a weakened, dependent sovereign in Atahualpa, or the perfect excuse to execute him.
So the outcome served both Indian and European agendas. Tragically, it doesn't almost matter who gave the final order.
Exactly. Whether it was Atahualpa fearing a coalition or the Spanish quietly suggesting it, the Spanish preferred Huáscar's absence, and the northern generals had motive to remove him. Their interests perfectly aligned toward a shared, violent outcome.
It's such a robust political reading of the sources.
And the execution itself, carried out by those northern commanders, was swift. It was meant as a final crushing message. But the crucial detail, the one you opened with, is how his body was disposed of. Dumped unceremoniously into the Andermarka River.
Right. Why was that so important? Why the river? What makes that such a powerful political act?
Because disposing of the body in the river prevents the funerary rites, the preparation, the entombment, the establishment of his own panaca, all the things that could have made him a martyr or a rallying symbol. In the Andean world, the body of the Sapa Inca is political legitimacy.
So you deny the ceremony.
And you deny him legitimacy in perpetuity. It was an act of profound political violence designed to erase dynastic memory from the public ritual sphere. Huáscar wasn't just killed, he was ritually annihilated.
And this act, this convenience, it just gives a massive political advantage to the Spanish. It removes the rival they might have had to manage. More importantly, it gives them the perfect pretext to accuse Atahualpa of fratricide and sacrilege.
Absolutely. The accusation of fratricide, the ultimate crime in European Christian morality, it became the indispensable moral instrument they used to justify executing Atahualpa. By prosecuting him for his brother's murder, the Spaniards could cynically portray themselves as enforcers of justice, not just opportunistic invaders.
So the dynamics of the ransom, which they now had, and the convenient death of Huáscar, they just converged into this one brutal certainty in the Spanish camp. Because even with the gold, they were still far from secure, deep in hostile territory.
And the rumors of resistance, of mobilization by figures like Rumi Ñahui, and the practical nightmare of transporting that treasure, it all made Atahualpa's continued survival a liability. He was a bargaining chip, yes, but once the gold was collected, he became a potential spark for an indigenous counterattack. Paranoia, coupled with opportunism, just pushed them toward the extreme solution.
Which is why his trial has to be seen as just the theater. It wasn't a search for truth. It had a pre-written ending.
Completely. The assembly that judged him wasn't an impartial tribunal. It was a choreography of political optics, designed solely to produce a justification for execution.
And the charges against him, idol worship, incest, murder, they were a necessary act of cultural translation, weren't they? They had to take acts of Indian sovereignty.
Where kinship, marriage, incest to Europeans was part of kingship, and ancestor worship, idol worship, was the core of the state.
And translate them into categories that would sound like unforgivable crimes back in Spanish courts.
The workshop of accusation didn't need legal coherence. It just needed justification. It needed to produce a verdict that would let European officers rationalize their actions, both for their own consciences and for the history books they were writing.
But Atahualpa, facing this inevitable guilty verdict, he makes one last crucial strategic decision. He wasn't afraid of death, but of the specific penalty, burning at the stake.
Burning carried this immense theological weight in Andean spiritual logic. It meant the permanent annihilation of the body, which in turn threatened the total obliteration of the soul. The impossibility of joining your ancestors.
So that fear, the fear of metaphysical erasure.
It forced him into a final bargain. Baptism, taking the Christian name Francisco, it was a political choice made under the most desperate duress, a desperate pragmatism. It was a tactical move, an exchange, to preserve his bodily integrity and the possibility of ritual continuity after death.
And the execution method, the garrote strangulation, was the compromise Pizarro reached. It left the body intact. It could be handled in Christian terms with a burial, and crucially, it allowed the Spanish to present the execution as measured and merciful compared to burning. But for Atahualpa, that difference was everything.
It was calculation, not mercy, that dictated the mode of his death.
So the execution of Atahualpa closes the chapter on the Civil War, but it opens this new, long phase. The Spanish conquest pivots from just hunting for treasure to the attempted administration of a conquered realm. And this wasn't an immediate takeover. It was a slow, procedural dismantling of what was left of the Inca state.
The Spanish were improvising constantly. They used a mix of temporary alliances with indigenous groups. They exploited existing regional divisions. A lot of non-Inca groups were happy to help against the northern regime. And they used sheer military force. But their early success rested heavily on the fact that the Civil War had already fractured the social fabric so extensively.
The native administrative apparatus just couldn't be reassembled.
It couldn't. The storehouses were looted, the Kopu registries were gone or scattered, and the crucial knowledge needed to mobilize labor and produce food across all those different ecological zones was just lost. Decentralized.
The Spanish found themselves governing a land that was already administratively hollowed out.
Yes, and that breakdown actually made their job easier.
Yeah.
They could just co-opt what little infrastructure was left without having to rebuild a functional native system. They just instituted foreign legal frameworks, demanded tribute, and enforced forced labor right on top of the ruins.
And the violence wasn't just military anymore. It became profoundly economic.
They re-engineered the entire system from a tribute economy, which was all about the temple, the state, the central storehouse network, the Kolkaba one that was oriented towards taxation, cash extraction, and export, mostly mining.
That shift from the Quokka system to a cash and export economy, that's a huge conceptual leap. How did that practically change life for the average person?
Think of it this way. Under the Inca, your labor was your tribute, and the state managed risks like famine through redistribution from those storehouses. It was a communal, reciprocal system. Once the Spanish introduced cash taxes and forced labor in mines, that entire reciprocal relationship just collapses.
So the safety net is gone.
Gone. Artisans who once made ritual objects for the temple economy, the very things Atahualpa melted down for ransom, they were redirected to make items for European trade. This just dissolved the economic logic that had bound that whole diverse polity together.
And the sheer volume of gold and silver taken, it wasn't just fiscal, you called it a symbolic expropriation.
Precisely. The physical removal of these precious metals from temples and their reframing as monetary wealth, it undermined the entire sacred cosmology. The extraction had both immediate economic ruin and lasting existential repercussions for Andean societies.
The question that still haunts historians is that ambiguity of responsibility for Huáscar's death. Did Atahualpa issue a direct order, or did the Spanish just let it happen, knowing it would give them the justification they needed?
The evidence is just inherently partial. The chronicles written by the Spanish participants, which say Atahualpa ordered it, you have to read them skeptically. They were written by men with a vested interest in making their actions seem lawful.
Of course.
And on the other hand, indigenous testimony was often suppressed or recorded much later through intermediaries who were also trying to navigate the colonial system. The most sound political reading just recognizes the reality of multiple actors with overlapping motives, northern generals desperate to win, Spanish agents eager for leverage, all leading to a shared outcome. The symbolic function was what mattered. The fratricide accusation became the ultimate political lever.
Resistance did continue, of course. Figures like Rumiñahui, who famously refused to be captured. But that resistance was limited by strategic isolation, by the complete lack of a coherent imperial command structure, which the Civil War had just shattered.
And the Spanish responded with brutal counterinsurgency and the rapid institution of forced labor. But the politics of memory became this silent field of indigenous resistance. The Andermarca River, where Huáscar was disposed of, it became a site of symbolic erasure, denying his supporters the ability to sustain his memory through public ritual.
And yet, indigenous communities still demonstrated powerful agency through active concealment.
Yes, concealment was survival. Caches of gold and silver that weren't paid as ransom were hidden. Sacred items, smaller mummies, ritual effigies, were moved to remote valleys. Clandestine burials were performed to deny the conquerors ritual control over the dead.
So protecting the remains became an act of resistance.
A profound and necessary act of cultural and political resistance. And this ambiguity over responsibility, this profound loss of institutional memory, it continues to feed debates over national identity, guilt, and restitution in South America even today. The Inca collapse is not just history. It is contested, living terrain.
So what does this all mean for us, for the listener, thousands of years later? The collapse of the Inca Empire was not simple, and we have to resist that old narrative of just Spanish superiority. The main takeaway here is that the fall was accelerated and completed by internal choices: political paranoia, a devastating succession crisis, the shock of disease, and the calculated destruction of their own institutional memory.
It was a systemic failure that met external opportunism. And the tragedy is that both Huáscar and Atahualpa were agents of an empire whose own logic permitted, even necessitated, violent alternatives in times of succession. To blame it all on one man misses the comprehensive collapse of legitimacy. The Civil War inflicted damage that made unified resistance structurally impossible.
Even if the Spanish had shown up 10 years later.
Exactly. The truth is stark and sobering. An empire that could synchronize harvests across mountains and manage millions of people through this ritualized web. It died a profound political death before the European armies ever assumed full control. The story of the Inca collapse is this profound historical warning about the fragility of any political order that's tied too closely to personal legitimacy and brittle succession roles. External conquest, as history shows us again and again, thrives on internal rot.
A sobering thought indeed. We hope this deep dive gave you a clear, if painful, look at what happens when the very pillars of a massive empire begin to crumble from within. Until next time.